Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we speak with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, we are joined by Bryan Helmkamp, who is the founder and CEO of Code Climate. Bryan Helmkamp, welcome to Maintainable.
Hey, Robby, how's it going?
Doing great. So I like to dive in and ask people, what do you believe are a few common traits that a software application's code base is being well maintained?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think maintainability is a really interesting sort of word because it tends to mean something different to everybody. The way that I think about maintainability is that it has to be evaluated relative to a task at hand. That is to say, it can't be evaluated as a fixed attribute of a piece of code or a code base. So if you have an artifact, maybe a module or a class, that class or module does not need to be changed, then it is maintainable by definition because it suits that future world. So I think that maintainability can be defined as the ability for a unit of software to be evolved to meet an actual need at the present time.
What's your take on the kind of the metaphor that we often find ourselves hearing about and using in the industry of technical debt?
Yeah. This is a battleground where I feel like a lot of people like to squabble. I find personally that the distinction is not all that helpful in terms of determining what to do on a go-forward basis. So, there's certainly different perspectives around technical debt. And, you have a lot of folks who will say things like technical debt is something that might have to be, incurred intentionally, and that can be a valuable process to make that trade-off. I totally agree with that. There are very frequently trade-offs that need to be made when designing a software program, and architectural trade-offs are one example of that. Certainly in other cases, you have situations where, the code could have been written better probably at that time. Maybe there was a corner that was cut for what could be considered a good reason or a bad reason. But at the end of the day, you're only as good as the code base that's in your sort of head ref point in your Git repository, right? Like that's the code that you have to live with. You kind of have to think about what are your priorities as you're moving forward. Those priorities often change. So it's not a fixed sort of set of priorities in terms of things like the way that we're architecting the code for flexibility or the sort of more tactical code maintainability issues like method structure and whatnot. And you sort of figure out what those priorities are relative to the technical side and the business side. And you try your best to sort of implement alongside those. And then what you get is the next, revisions of the software, which may or may not have, technical debt in them, but hopefully they're achieving the business case and hopefully you're able to get that alignment relative to what you feel is important as a technical team.
As you reflect back on your own career as a developer before becoming a CEO of a company and having your own product, do you feel like you're using technical debt as a phrase at all in your glossary of software development?
Yeah, sure. Certainly, I think that was a phrase that would come into the conversation, especially with product stakeholders. It feels like there's technical debt in this area. That would be a conversation.
If you could go back and give yourself some advice on what you've learned since then, what would you tell yourself for those people that are maybe earlier on in their career where they hear people using it, may not totally understand it, and like some advice on how to potentially not use it?
When I was younger and doing software engineering, I held a lot of ideals around what, great, excellent code looked like. And I feel like it probably created some level of anxiety and in some cases unhappiness in me when I had to work on code that did not, meet those standards of, in my head, what excellent code was, at that time. Because it would feel like, this would be easier if only this had been written better the first time and all that type of thing. And that can feel frustrating and it can feel like you're not being as effective as you could be otherwise. But ultimately, our job as professional software engineers is to kind of get out of the lab and deliver working software that fulfills a business need as best as possible. And so I would encourage myself to kind of take a little bit of a step back to this broader frame of, well, are we creating value relative to, and all value creation is relative, and are we creating value relative to where we were yesterday? There are a number of interesting challenges in dealing with legacy code bases, actually, that you don't really get to experience if you're only dealing with greenfield projects. And those are skills, like any skill, that need to be exercised and learned over time. And so I would try to encourage my younger self to treat those as opportunities, working on legacy code and code that has technical debt. I don't know if the 15-year younger version of me would actually appreciate that advice, but that would be the message.
Thinking about how I personally, even as a software developer, going through different eras of good enough versus like, ooh, I want to set the bar a little higher, or work with other people that set their bar higher than I could ever feel like I could ever get to, even as someone that like has had a number of really talented software developers work for me, where my bar is far lower than their bar for different reasons. And it's always been like, how do we get this thing in line at some point? For those that aren't familiar, maybe kind of pivoting over a little bit as you're reflecting on that in your own, maybe having more of a stricter set of ideals. We have tools out there that help us know how, to some degree, how healthy or maintainable our code is. And you built a product called Code Climate. So maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about it if they're not familiar with it. What inspired you to begin building it in the first place?
Yeah, happy to. So I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Code Climate. We actually have two products now, which are both related to bringing data into software engineering processes. One of them, which is called Quality, is about bringing information about code quality, especially maintainability, into software development workflows. The other, which is called Velocity, can be thought of as data-driven insights for software development processes and teams. And that's a newer product, which we developed a couple years ago. But when we got started, we basically had seen this issue of teams with skilled developers and good intentions run into problems with maintainability as their code bases matured and grew. And so our original hypothesis was that, well, you can certainly find a lot of data around code quality, things like static analysis, information, and test coverage. But most of the developers that I knew at the time, and these were mostly, Ruby developers because my background was in Ruby software engineering, we weren't using that type of information in our day-to-day when we were writing code. So the hypothesis behind Code Climate originally was, can we take data about code quality, bring it into engineering workflows, and enable software developers to have better conversations about code quality as they're writing the code, make better decisions, and ultimately deliver higher quality code bases. So the way that works is it tends to be an integration in the GitHub pull request workflow. I mean, people weren't really even using pull requests back when we got started, but that's how people use it now. And the focus is on at least making sure that you have the information when you're deciding to merge a change about how it could impact the future maintainability of the code base so that you can make that informed decision.
We've been longtime customers ourselves of Code Quality product in particular. We haven't necessarily baked it into our PR process necessarily, but we do go look at the reports and kind of get a sense of how the application's grading. Or another way we use it quite a bit is because we inherit or do a lot of code audits for our clients. And it's one of the quickest things for us to just be like, all right, let's just add this into Code Climate, let it run its thing, go look at the reports, and that'll help highlight some areas that we should probably bring up. So it does some of the work for us in some way that we can then relay to that company's business stakeholders, because they're not necessarily going to be diving into the why is this function too long type of conversation, but they want to know some of those high levels. So it's a great product for things like that we've been able to find. And I think it's interesting thinking about how you could use that on the pull request level to show you that, like, hey, you're introducing some things that could be breaking your team's conventions. I know, like in the Ruby world, we've got things like RuboCop and other code analysis things, but being able to like provide a more of a higher picture, like, hey, the overall grading of this application is going to go down a little bit more. I also remember that we had a project that came our way last year where it was a PHP app, and we don't do PHP, but they were thinking about rewriting it. And they asked us to run, to look at their old code base, and we run it into Maintainable and into the Code Climate app. It has some metrics or some I think it was, I forget the way it's phrased, but there's some metrics in there that kind of give you an indication of potentially how many months or years it might take to clean up the mess. And I think in that one, it was like over a decade or something. And they're like, that's crazy. We've only been building this app for 5 years, and now it's going to take 10 years to clean it up. And I'm like, it's probably not inaccurate, actually. But I don't know. There's a lot of, I think, useful ways that tools like Code Climate can be quite helpful. To take a little bit, if you don't mind, revealing behind the curtain a little bit of your own organization, or how do you organize your engineering teams? I think before we started recording, you mentioned you have about 40 people now. Do you have multiple teams working on different products or different areas of the products? How does that kind of, at a high level, look like at the moment?
Yeah. Well, today it looks like we have about 3 discrete engineering squads is the term that we're using these days. I would say in terms of the organizational structure of our engineering department, it's something that we look at regularly and have adjusted a number of times over the past year and a half. So we've had cases, our headcount has changed. Our headcount has grown over the past year in engineering. So we've had to make adjustments for that. But we've had cases over the past year where we were working in, for example, 2 separate teams. We merged them together for some period of time, basically based on the sort of the nature of the work that we knew the team was going to have to engage in for 3 to 6 months. And we thought that it was going to actually be more effective to have them sort of caucusing all in the same group and then split it back out again. So, we think of the organization as kind of this living organism that needs to be, regularly sort of adjusted to meet the new realities.
That's interesting. Does your team use anything like Scrum, Kanban type boards to manage your work? What tools are you using? Not that we need to get too far in the weeds there, but just at a high level, what's your kind of approach for that right now?
Yeah, so we run kind of a combination of a Kanban and Scrum type process. I think some people use the word Scrumban, but it's generally a just in time sort of lean process. We don't do estimates. We focus more on the kind of idea around what would we be willing to invest in order to achieve this outcome. This is kind of aligned with some of the philosophy that I've seen the Basecamp folks talk about. Okay, we want to make an improvement here. How much are we willing to sort of invest in that? We'd feel really excited to make a 1 week investment in this area, and then working backwards from there into terms of figuring out, okay, well, in a week we probably can do A and B, but C is just not gonna happen. And then say, okay, let's try to get to A and B being complete by the end of the week.
Interesting. So kind of applying a little bit of a time boxing methodology in some ways, like a cost around some window of time.
Yes, we prefer to sort of focus on, whenever possible, fixing the time period and then adjusting the scope to sort of fit within that. Of course, that is easy to say, and in some cases tricky to do depending on the nature of the work.
Are there types of processes that you've tried to implement that you, say, 10 years ago would have thought, no way, that sounds overkill for any team that you would have been part of?
Well, we've migrated to Jira. There was certainly a time in my career when that sounded like the least appealing potentially project management tool. It had this reputation of being big and clunky and used in these enterprises. But I actually have been really enjoying it. The Jira user interface has gotten quite good, and you can kind of see where there's a lot of power there in terms of giving you what you need. So that's probably one of those things that we've shifted on.
I know we've been using Jira for about 6 or 7 years. I think I remember earlier on, but prior to that, we had evaluated it and been like, feels so overkill. This is so complicated. You need in the same way that I feel about using a lot of AWS features when you don't really understand everything that's in there. It's Jira is very powerful. I think they've definitely simplified the onboarding experience for teams to be all right, here's some kind of useful defaults to work with, and then you can extend. Where I felt like a decade ago, it was a lot of customizing to figure out how to make it work for your team. And there's still areas of Jira that I really don't understand how it fits together. But anyways, without getting too big long spiel about that, Is there any other types of processes that you're finding your team has kind of pitched or is now doing that you might not have thought about, like from a day-to-day development standpoint? Do you do a lot of pairing or things like that at all?
Yeah, we do RFCs for some changes. Those are basically write-ups that are stored in a separate Git repository of a proposed change. We try to use those sparingly because they do sort of involve an extra cycle, which isn't focused on sort of writing working software. And so I think that's a very careful balance in terms of making sure that you're not spending a bunch of time writing what effectively turns into a spec and then gets thrown out the window when the coding starts. But we found that those are useful when we're doing changes that have a pretty high degree of engineering precision that needs to be applied. So, for example, changes that might affect the security of the application. We're working on one right now that's for an auto provisioning feature, and it has integration points with SAML and OAuth, and then there's the schema changes that need to be made to sort of implement that. And so for those types of things, it can be quite helpful. But I think we really need to be careful about going too overboard on that type of thing.
That makes sense. Is it safe to assume that even a tool like CodeClimate Quality has incurred some of its own technical debt? Or is you have all A's across the board there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, certainly, right? That application, we started working on that about 9 years ago. I wrote some of the initial code, so it definitely has its areas that are in need of improvement. But I don't know if this is a controversial opinion or not. I feel like a high-functioning software team, and I'll sort of scope this down a bit. A high-functioning software development team working in a Ruby on Rails code base, which is what the quality application is built on, can do quite a good job of maintaining an application that is well-structured for a long period of time without having to take on a bunch of, big technical debt reduction efforts and that type of thing. What I found with Rails, and one of the things that really appealed to me when I got started building Rails applications, is that it is inherently sort of oriented towards a set of concepts that do make applications easier to conceptualize and implement, up until the point where it doesn't. And there's certainly cases for that. Certain types of super complex business logic that don't map well to active record models can be quite thorny in a Rails code base. But if you can kind of be heads up about those, be heads up about, the way you're thinking about things like class and method structures, duplication, which can always be a challenge, then you can have a code base which grows for a long period of time, grows significantly in size, and is still quite high quality at the end of that period. So I think the CodeClimate scores for our quality application are around an A or B level at any given point in time. And it's kind of stayed there. Now, there's a bias, of course, because the algorithms that are in the quality application that assess code quality of a Ruby application are the algorithms that our team ourselves implemented. So they certainly are cognizant of them. But I think it is possible if you do it carefully.
Do you feel like your team has a good process for managing things like as new versions of Ruby on Rails comes out, for example? I think that sometimes it gets kind of labeled as technical debt when your application starts to fall behind a few versions or so. Do you feel like your team's been able to be pretty successful at keeping somewhat up to date on that stuff?
Yeah, most of our dependencies are quite up to date. There are, occasionally cases where something falls a bit behind. Some of that work we handle with a rotation type arrangement. So we do, for example, monthly security audits where we go through and check on a bunch of different things and make sure that everything is, as you would expect it to be from a security standpoint. And one of those things that we look at during those security audits is dependencies and making sure that we are where we want to be. When we allocate engineering effort for performing something like a security audit, we try to make sure we're budgeting in time, not just for auditing, but also to take corrective actions, as part of that. In some cases, we'll spin up separate, cards that maybe need to go be assigned in an independent process. But in a lot of cases, we're just, making those changes right as we go through the audit process itself.
We'll be back with our interview with Bryan in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you. Thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Also, do you know someone in our industry that I should be speaking with on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm. And now, back to our interview with Bryan Helmkamp. I know leading up to our conversation, you touched a little bit on, we talk about how things are within your own engineering team, but I'm imagining you get to interact to some level with your customers. What sorts of common problems are you seeing surface themselves across clients that you're interacting with on maybe a consultative side about helping them make sense of the data that they're being provided from your application?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, we have spent a lot of time working with thousands of engineering organizations on, some form or another, on issues related to code quality, and certainly have a ton of conversations about that type of thing. And we've learned a lot over the years. When it comes to code quality, one of the things that I think is important to kind of keep in perspective is the why behind it, right? So, you can talk about the maintainability of something, and there's this question of, well, why does that actually matter, right? And it kind of almost sounds like a silly question, right? Of course, it matters because we want better code, and we want better code so that we can deliver quickly. But that second part is really important. It's often the case that CEOs don't really care about maintainability. They care about their customers. They care about their teams being happy and having high employee morale and retention. And they care about profits so that they can, build a sustainable business. But unless, something that you're doing is connected to one of those types of priorities, it's going to be difficult to make a case to a CEO why it's important. Now, if you kind of go to the next level down, then you're looking at VPs of engineering, right? Interestingly, I would say that we've seen that many VPs of engineering don't really care about maintainability as its own sort of priority. What they care about is delivery. So, shipping code quickly and also predictably. And they care very much about their teams. So again, the sort of morale and retention of their software engineers. Software engineers can be difficult to hire. They spend a lot of money on training them. They want them to sort of be around for a long time and be able to feel effective. So that's kind of, once you go through those two levels, then you can get to maintainability, right? Which is that we want the code to be maintainable so that we can deliver on our priorities rapidly and effectively and predictably. And so that the engineers, when they're delivering on those priorities, they feel efficient, and engineers who feel efficient tend to have high morale. So I think the first thing that we often talk about with clients is kind of popping that why stack to get sort of all the way up there, because you don't want to have a case where something like a metric inadvertently becomes a goal in and of itself. Right. You can have metrics there's a lot of valuable information you can get from metrics. And, our entire business in a way is built around data, insights, metrics, quantitative information around software and software delivery processes. But you don't want to kind of have the tail wagging the dog. The data can be very useful for doing things like diagnosis. So you mentioned, for example, looking at a new code base, and you're not going to ask somebody to read 50,000 lines of code to sort of assess what's going on. You can use tools for that. So you can get value from data there. And then you can also get value from data in terms of like verifying outcomes. So we wanted to, reduce the dependencies over here, and we were successful in doing that. And we have a data point that shows that, but you don't want it to be devoid of context. We'll work with teams on, figuring out what their priorities are, figuring out what their strategy is in order to implement those priorities, and then try to equip them with the best tooling and visibility and information in order to do that, both in terms of a day-to-day workflow. So getting information like in pull requests around things like copied and pasted code, as well as at a higher level, looking sort of retrospectively across periods of time and saying, okay, this is how things are trending.
You make a lot of good points in there about how teams are. I know that developers often struggle to bring up technical problems with, say, product owners, the other stakeholders, because it's like they're having different conversations. Like, well, is this just because you have a preference for code being done in a certain way, or maybe you disagree with how something was done in the past, and you want to approach that with, this would make my life easier if we could clean this up, is sometimes the conversation, but sometimes it's just, this is a problem over here, we need to take care of it at some point. And that doesn't always easily translate to, okay, great, here's a thumbs up, go ahead and prioritize that over the next sprint or whatever. Hearing you talk about how even like the validity of your product is reliant on reframing that conversation to not be, here's a reporting tool that just gives you just like keeping like some sort of big brother look over the code from a, like, how's my team doing versus this is a tool that if we can start moving, can you prove that if we use tools like this to give us more information, and we can say, hey, as we're cleaning things up, it's improving our team's morale, improving retention, making it easier for us to bring in and attract the talent we want, because nobody wants to join a company that has a bunch of huge messes. And there are developers that like to roll their sleeves up, but if it's too big of a challenge to get to that, or to sell them on improving things, this is, as a consultant, this is where I get pulled in all the time. But then we hear the same conversations that like, well, it's not a priority right now. And so they give up a little too soon. Sometimes developers they feel like I've brought this up a bunch of times. I get pushback on a no because I asked if we could do that. But sometimes they don't always. What kind of advice could you offer people like that they might already feel like they've went down that road, they've raised their concerns, and maybe felt like, well, apparently it doesn't matter to the business. And so I'm not going to keep complaining, and I'll just do my job and call it a day each day when it comes to code, but until I go find some other job one day.
Yeah, I mean, I would say first and foremost, sort of, it can be helpful to get an understanding of the context that the company or the team is in from a business perspective, for example. So, learning to speak the language of stakeholders in your organization, and learning what is the CEO sort of thinking about. Hopefully, the CEO is doing a good job of communicating with the entire organization, how they think about where the company and the product is in the market and what that suggests in terms of the way the company needs to operate. But try to put yourself in the shoes of those sort of people on the business side and what they're trying to achieve. So, you kind of mentioned that in an organization that has really bad code, it can be difficult to attract and retain talent. And that's certainly the case. But I'll tell you what, a company with great code, but no revenues becomes a crappy place to work over time. It might be a great place to work for a while when the VC money is flowing and everybody can have their sort of own microservice and feel great about it. But if that software is not ultimately generating revenue, the whole organization is going to feel pretty crummy after some amount of time when the shoe drops on that. So you kind of have to understand, which context are you in? Is the context that you're in, look, we don't have any revenue or not enough revenue, and we need to figure out what customer problem we can solve to deliver value that then we can sort of scale up. And this gets to this question of product market fit. If you're pre-product market fit, and you're in an engineering organization and you're talking to, a business stakeholder about maintainability, it's a challenge, right? And it's a challenge because a code base that has no business value is sort of maintainable by definition, in the sense that it should just be deleted and replaced with something that does deliver business value. And, for better or worse, it often takes iterations of a product in order to get to something that does deliver business value. But if you're on the other side of the coin, you're working at a company that has achieved product market fit, and therefore it's a going concern. It is a expectation that business will exist, 10 years in the future financially, because it's got the financials to do that. Then I think it's helpful to frame things in terms of what future advantage will be conferred based on this additional work. So maybe it's something like, look, it's expensive for us to think about shifting our data storage strategy and using a new sort of database. But if we we're on a new database, we sort of would have these other advantages. Can we be able to implement this set of features much quicker? And that can be compelling. And then the other sort of advice I would give is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So sometimes I feel like there's this, not intentionally, everyone's kind of coming at it with trying to do things that they think are positive, but almost this sort of like standoff around, well, we need to do A, B, C, D, E. Otherwise, we're going to be screwed, right? So that kind of, the developers are sort of negotiating, right? And they feel like they need to insist on, that everything A, B, C, D, E all need to be done. And then that kind of can cause the product side or the business side to sort of recoil and say, well, wait a minute. If that's the case, like we can't do any of that because, we're never going to get any new features out the door. So I think it's incumbent on, all roles within a software delivery organization to sort of understand that very few things are accurately described in absolutes, that there are almost always cases where you can sort of find a middle ground and then start to build up that trust. I think a big part of it is what I've seen in engineering organizations is sometimes engineers don't trust that they will be able to ever revisit something. And there's like a lot of baggage in that statement, right? Like, and certainly people have probably worked in organizations where they felt that was the case. The statement itself assumes that there will be a need to revisit something. And, to my previous point around maintainability being relative to the task at hand, that might not be the case. So I think on the one hand, the engineers need to kind of get comfortable with the idea that, yeah, we might never get back to it. And that's okay. Maybe that module just ends up getting deleted and taken out to pasture in a couple of years because it didn't, end up delivering a feature that was valuable. And then on the other side, I think the business stakeholders need to feel comfortable that, the engineers, because they have this specialized knowledge and are so close to the code, if they are doing their job well, and you're communicating with them effectively about future priorities, they are able to sort of make those informed decisions around prioritization and not feel like they have to run every one of those questions back through a business stakeholder, which adds a lot of time and sort of unneeded communication loops.
I think you make a lot of really good recommendations for people to kind of, encouraging, people listening to really reflect on, as you said in your words, think about the context that they're in and knowing that there's different stages of a business and you can have the most perfect maintainable code base, but if there's no customers or product market fit there, then it's basically worthless. And it's an investment that it's not going to return anything to the business. And so you're not going to be able to maintain it anyways. So some good advice to kind of reflect on that a little bit and think about where you are as a business, but also doesn't mean to stop fighting the good fight and, encourage some good best practices here and there and using things like Code Climate to help you like have some sort of knowledge about and some data to back up how your sentiment or your subjective feelings that you might have as a developer, like using some tools that can objectively provide some feedback loops to your team, I think is quite helpful as well. So I know that you're a busy person and you've got a number of things to take care of, but a couple last quick questions. Where can listeners best follow your thoughts on software development online?
Yeah, so those are best taken a look at on the Code Climate blog. That is where sort of our best thinking tends to sort of land, and that is that can be found at codeclimate.com.
What non-software development book do you find yourself recommending to people in our industry a lot?
Yeah, so I kind of knew that this question was coming. I got a tip off from a little bird that I might be asked this, and I spent some time thinking about it. It's kind of interesting because, all of my day tends to be focused on software development. We build software tools for software teams. And so that can sort of be very meta sometimes. So I thought I would answer a slightly different question, which is kind of like, what book would you sort of recommend to somebody, a software engineer who wants to maybe better improve maintainability or understand how to get maintainability sort of work done in their organization? That's not a software engineering related book. And what I would do is I would figure out what your CEO is reading, find a way to read whatever book they would recommend about your particular industry, because it can give you a lot of context in terms of trying to communicate more effectively in the language of the business stakeholders who are around you. So I think it's going to vary for every software engineer depending on the team and the products that they're working on. But I would say find, that best book about whether it's media or advertising or e-commerce, the domain that you're working in, and spend a little bit of time getting familiar with, how people are talking about things in that industry, because that's going to lead you to a better ability to communicate with the rest of your organization. And then you can contextualize conversations about code quality, architecture, and maintainability through those lenses, which can be very helpful.
I think that's some really good advice on seeking out that. So any tips on how to ask a CEO outside of just dropping a quick email?
Yeah, my experience is that CEOs actually love to be pinged about these types of things. So do not feel like your CEO is a scary person to talk to and they don't want to hear from you. They love to share, and they spend a lot of time thinking about all these types of things. So I would send them that Slack DM, and it will probably be well received.
I think so too. Well, it's been such a delight having you on Maintainable, Bryan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, this was great. Sorry I have to run today, but I would love to come back again and continue another conversation.
That would be awesome. Thanks again.
Maintainable.